Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The legacy of Yale rests on nothing more than a pillar of oppression, where the very name of one of the world's most glorious universities reflects not only the subjugation of the black body, but that of the South Asian colonial community, if you could call it as such. Our model is simple. Yale should rename to the Harriet Tubman College. We're going to take a bold stance on opening government. Harriet Tubman was an American abolitionist. She was born into slavery and escaped and subsequently made over 10 key missions to rescue slaves. Yale will come out and recognize that Elihu Yale's atrocities are the reason that they are changing the name instead erring to honor a true abolitionist who fought for rights. We have the fiat to make this change because this House would debate, and so we get fiat to decide what we are changing it to. We'd like to discuss two things in this speech. First, the principal obligation to change its name, and second, what this does for activism and student bodies on the ground. So first then, on the principle. The principal obligation to there is a principal obligation to associate the names of slave owners with their express crimes against humanity as opposed to glorification. The problem that we identify in the status quo is that even in liberal circles, slavery and the remnants of oppression are seen as a condition experienced by black people as opposed to active actions taken by individuals. The way we talk about slavery in society is desensitized because we do not put onus on the actions of those who committed them. Additionally, we find various historical reasons to forgive them. Perhaps they were just a subject of their time without actually recognizing the impact that their actions had and continuing to propagate them. Derived from this is an obligation to place blame in a discursive space on those actors so that we no longer just talk about slaves, but we talk about the slave owners and collectively interrogate the unjust enrichment. Second to note is how we meet this principal obligation to reshape discourse. One, on their side of the House, people are forced to interact with the ways in which Yale means slavery. We accept that when we change the name, it will be discussed. Two, I think it is important to note that the current association of the name is one of glorification. Example, Yale is prestigious, impressive. It's a brand name that gives you status and prestige. This brand is uniquely re-traumatizing on a principle basis, the same way as Cecil Rhodes ought to have no place in Oxford. This is perhaps something we would stand against as well. I want to note that even if Yale is just one school, it is very large. And even if the impact is marginal, it amounts to real psychological trauma for the black community. On this principle grounds alone, irrespective of any consideration of pragmatics, it is imperative that Yale change the name to something that is far more representative of the emotions people feel on the ground, which is why we're in favor of changing it to Harriet Tubman. Second, Yale taking this action, this is our second argument, Yale taking this action bolsters the type of change across the country and perhaps specifically at universities. It's important to note that symbolic issues like these are incredibly important to many students and more broadly people in the country. While it may be easy to call these people snowflakes who are merely bothered by name or whatnot, these are issues that are incredibly passionate about. For example, a recently well-known university changed the name of a public space that glorified someone, a donor who was recently exposed by the Me Too movement. Surveys during that change at the university revealed that a good size of the population felt unsafe when they had to walk into a swanky building that glorified someone who had done such despicable things. When Yale takes this action, they are sending a message that they will do everything in their power to correct the wrongs that serve as their heritage. And they are also saying that they are willing to forego things like donor connections and legacy in order to correct this wrong. Why, then, will this significantly increase the probability of success in other such cases across the country? First, Yale sends a stance that they're willing to forego all of the other pragmatic considerations that are associated with its brand, for example, like donor attraction or legacy for the sake of righting principal wrongs. Two, changing the names is a drastic action that locks the university into a stance that requires it to be truly interrogative of the biases that exist right now. What is the problem with any comparative for reform that opposition will bring you? The problem is that these changes rarely have any staying power. That is to say, people who have tried to call, for example, people who have tried to call for a ban on fraternities for years, the administration simply does not listen. The reason we get more scrutiny into these changes in the future is that now university administrations have made an active and clear political stance. Third, this emboldens activists in universities and across the country and perhaps in other parts of the world. Before I get into this, I'll take a POI from closing.
Would you force everyone with the name Eli to change their name as well?
Probably not, simply because it's Eli Yale, who's such a deplorable person, and not the three letters ELI. Okay, so why Yes. Why do we embolden activists in universities across the world and in the country? So one of the things you have to understand that is incredibly hard to pressure universities to make college more equitable. That is, often rich old donors and conservatives who care a lot about tradition make it so that it's incredibly hard to make substantive change. Again, for example, look at the tireless efforts of the engender activists at Yale to curtail the harms of fraternities. Inspiring activists with drastic symbolic language is often valuable because these are often individuals with limited time and often limited resources to advocate for change. The way that you rally people to act for change is by making them believe that change is possible. When you do something as drastic as honoring one of the greatest abolitionists of our time, you are likely to get more activism in the first place. Additionally, there are incentives for groups to collaborate with each other when they're focusing on similar issues. There are a lot of mechanistic work required to make these changes. You have to petition universities, you have to talk to key stakeholders, write articles, write op-eds, interview students, etc. This is something that happens all across the university community. For example, the students at Princeton recently fought and succeeded to rename their Woodrow Wilson Policy School to something else. On our side of the house, it is far more likely that these groups are going to engage in this sort of crosstalk, engage in this sort of coalition building, etc., which makes it more likely that change happens when different groups from different universities and different organizations are willing to back these type of issues in a world where Yale is already making the change, thus setting a precedent. On the ground, this looks like far more pressures to change structures within. And this is how that manifests itself. First, it increases discourse about this in a large-scale way. Every single student, alumni, professor, etc., has to engage with this issue because it is so visceral and so close to their life. It's literally impossible for you to be a member of the New Haven community, or I guess a student of college age or a university student, and not hear about this. Additionally, people within the framework of these movements, both domestically, internationally, and at different universities, are forced to question the way different symbolic idols plague discourse. That is to say, when you can tell your family and friends that I go to Yale, where you're also supporting the legacy of someone who's done such atrocious things, it forces you to check yourself at that level. I do think that this can have a huge impact on people in terms of the form of a microaggression, or just reminding them of just how inequitable society is on those grounds. This type of pressure then, when it comes from the bottom up at every single level of the university structure and the broader student community, is likely to yield higher probabilities of change on any of these issues across the globe, across the board. Finally, to note here is that activist culture is incredibly important at the student level. And this is something that people critique about different universities and the things that they promote. For example, some schools are very pre-professional, etc. I think when a school like Yale goes and takes this stance, it is emboldening any type of student activism on the ground level. Look, even if OP will argue that there are better ways to engage in student activism, getting a concentrated response is far more important for that community. And for all those reasons, let Yale fall.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Yale is still complicit in institutionalized racism. Our claim is going to be that it is far better to have a constant reminder of that complicity rather than to have the university progressive watch their campus culture and create harms that are far worse than the minor trivial harm of having a name that is oppressive. I'm going to start out with refutation and then get into two claims. Firstly, why this reduces the burden on Yale to actively change and rectify forms of oppression, and then secondly, why this will polarize campus culture in ways that are actively harmful. Getting into rebuttal, I want to start by engaging with their fiat that they can just call the school Harriet Tubman. In this House would rename Yale motion, they have the fiat to rename the institution, but not to fiat what they will change the institution to. I would posit that people who are in positions of power in Yale, like the rich white dudes, are probably going to just name them after like a prominent Yale alumni or like maybe a really rich senator who graduated from Yale, because that resonates a lot more with their personal identity. However, we are going to engage with like renaming the school to a very progressive thing and explain why that is still bad. In terms of refutation to the on a principled basis, this is really traumatizing. A couple responses. The first thing to say is that I think that they overstate the extent to which an oppressive name is like very, very traumatic to the average student. In the least trivializing way possible, I think this is something that is like annoying, but I think that like this is very, very removed from current lived experiences. I think that he's a less well-known racist figure than a lot of other people. I think it's something that is uncomfortable, but I don't think it carries like the tripling trauma on a daily basis and the way that Gov is saying. I would posit that we're going to weigh harms under our side of the house that are more traumatic, like getting more like faculty of color, stuff like that. But secondly, in terms of the principled act itself, I would posit that you are actively committing a moral wrong by renaming the school. This is due to the fact that Yale as an institution is trying to get PR, and in a means to get PR is actively profiting off of the oppression of people in the past, right? Like Yale is basically just trying to forward their bottom line. I think it's bad to like instrumentalize someone's legacy who was really, really beneficial in the anti-slavery movement, and it means to just like benefit the school overall. In terms of Yale having a signaling effect to other institutions, we just in general think that renaming is just a form of like harmful progressive washing, and we don't support it. I'll clash with their last argument implicitly. First claim, how do we place a greater burden on Yale to actively rectify and change their actions? The thesis of this argument that it is better to have a continual legacy of like racial oppression existing as opposed to trying to erase it. Under the status quo, how does having an oppressive name create some kind of a push to actually reform your practices? Two mechanisms here. The first thing to say is that it is a principled acknowledgement that the university is actively complicit in institutionalized racial oppression. You are admitting that things of the past have not ended. Things like Yale's admission processes are actively racialized in nature, where they preclude disproportionately students of color, where faculty tends to be privileged. You're saying that this oppression still exists, and you're not pretending that it is only a thing of the past. But secondly, this is just like a very thing for minority students on campus to point towards as an example of complicity. It is just clear evidence that your school is like very, very racist. But when you're advocating for other goals, i.e. like courses that pander toward Black students, you're able to use this as a valuable form of evidence. What then happens on the comparative? I think that this allows Yale to market themselves as being a highly progressive institution in spite of the bad practices that they engage in a similar way to how corporations attempt to greenwash themselves under the status quo. This will happen in a couple ways. I think that firstly, the average student is just going to become substantially less introspective about their school overall at the point at which they buy it's now like committed to Black rights and to like anti-slavery causes. So you create a form of individualized introspection, which will be manifest in like less student like newspapers reporting on these actively racist practices. But secondly, on a wider social level, as the PM literally concedes, what you get is like just a host of positive PR going to this university, right? Like in the media, Yale is being marketed as this really great progressive institution. Why is this like positive PR likely to be long-lasting and not something that we can check against? I think that firstly, individuals have an anchoring bias in terms of how they perceive future information. So if you believe that Yale is already progressive, you're going to take other information like about them being racist less seriously or not evaluate it to the same extent. But secondly, if you do get criticism of Yale, it's a lot easier for student groups to dismiss that on the basis of like, look at this really, really progressive thing that they have done. What is the impact of this argument? The push for actual racialized reform under our side of the house is substantially better. More scholarships for Black students, more courses that cater towards students of color, more faculty of color, stuff like that. When we don't like progressive wash the institution and we continue the push under the status quo. In terms of weighing this claim, I would argue that like actually getting more Black students like accepted is probably a greater harm than minor feelings of trivialization of a university being named something racist. Second argument, how is this likely to increase on-campus polarization? The thesis of this argument is that people are going to get angry and like a bunch of bad harms are going to ensue from that. How is this policy going to be received? Firstly, it's going to be received badly because it's just seen as being like incredibly anti-traditional. We agree with PM that like the name of Yale is part of the Ivy League prestige that it ultimately has, and is seen as being embedded in like deep historic facts, and just like the average student for prestige reasons cares about that a lot. But secondly, in the current very polarized political climate in the United States of America, it's just seen as like pandering toward ridiculous leftist social justice warriors, and I think you're gonna like massively revitalize like free speech debate and stuff like that and make right-wing groups very, very angry when you're seen as like pandering toward the really problematic leftists. What then are the impacts likely to be? Before that, though, we'll take closing government.
If we need things to be a reminder of oppression, would you also not be okay with things like the taking down of Confederate statues, where one or two of these cases cause an entire wave of these statues being destroyed?
Okay, in terms of statues, I think that's different because I think that we can just like potentially put them in like museums and then get awareness being generated in other ways. But I would also posit that when it comes to a school institution itself, it's important to have this like reminder specifically, as opposed to just like the vague narrative of like racism still exists coming from statues that we can also help perpetuate in like other ways potentially. So in terms of the harms on campus when like people get angry, I think that firstly, you massively embolden right-wing groups on campus, right? I think that like harms of this are like more people joining potentially like alt-right and free speech groups, people who are already radical becoming more radical and like pushing for more like problematic people to speak at the university overall, more microaggressions on campus in general when people are really angry about this policy. It is true that it happens under the status quo to some extent, but it gets a lot worse when people are like very angry about the name. I would also posit that this harm exists beyond Yale itself, given that when this gets a lot of media attention in society holistically, you're also going to radicalize these groups on other campuses. Secondly, left-wing groups on campus are also likely to lose some kind of political support in capital. Firstly, they're going to just lose broad support when they need to like defend this change, but be broadly unpopular on campus overall. They'll also have to spend a lot of like their newspaper time and their media time commenting and defending this change overall. I would posit that it is better for them to like use their resources to engage in like fundraising to actually create better accessibility for students as a whole. Thirdly, you place minorities on campus in a very uncomfortable position where they're probably going to get like interviewed about this name being changed, and I think that they may face like personal repercussions if they do this when it's very unpopular and there's a really bad microaggressions. I think that finally, Trump is also part of like the polarized debate. It's very likely that he could just like remove scholarship funding from Yale that helps a lot of students to try and create the kind of signaling effect that OG is talking about, which is bad because just like remove resources that actually help people. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening opposition.
Thank you for that speech. We'd like to call upon the second speaker for the government.
Cool. I'll take POIs in the chat. Okay. Opening opposition is ignorant in their knowledge about how the aggregation of microaggressions and the glorification of past slave owners affects the psyche and psychological violence against BIPOC communities in the US. Did you know that at Yale, an employee was driven to literally throw a chair to the stained glass wall of Calhoun College? This wasn't because they were mildly stressed out by the fact that the literal place where they worked, in the literal city that they lived, was named after someone that oppressed their ancestors in the most horrific ways possible. I think opening opposition needs to reckon with the fact that the psychological violence of living in a society that glorifies racism, that glorifies slave owners, that doesn't own up to the fact that these individuals were perpetrators of the worst crimes against humanity is actually something terrible. It's not just merely stressful. Words on the street when you are harassed are also stressful, but what is more stressful is living in a situation where you are constantly reminded that these actors are glorified. Quick clarification on the quibbles from CO and OO. 3 things. 1, we're not forcing anybody to change their name. We're saying this house, as this house being Yale, would change its name voluntarily. 2, I'm happy to say in general, people shouldn't name their kids after famous war criminals or monsters. For example, happy to defend people not naming their kid Adolf. I'm totally fine with that. 3, I think OO's quibble on the fiat is ridiculous, right? It's like saying in the motion, this house would subsidize green energy. OG can't model how much they want to subsidize or in which forms of green energy they want to prioritize those subsidies. Engage with the comparative, but being OG, we only got 15 minutes of prep, we at least get some modeling power, right? So deal with the comparative. First, I'm going to start on rebuttal to opening opposition, because they say this will sanitize Yale's image and make it seem like they're really woke and people will ignore other harms. 4 points to note. 1, this is ridiculous on the comparative because Yale's image in the status quo is already sanitized. That is, they are already seen in a positive light rather than a negative way. This ignores Viggy's argument about how public scrutiny right now is very hard to develop in the first place. Second, our argument about activist inspiration shows that we do the opposite of ignoring harms. This is important because even if you buy OO's best case scenario that some people in the middle ground or some moderates will be like, now they're finally doing enough for Black people and they actually think that changing a name is enough to restitution for Black people, the activists on the ground, who Viggy characterizes as currently disillusioned by the fact that change is so hard to achieve, disillusioned by a lack of symbols of public success in the face of the rise of Trump and the alt-right, are actually going to be more emboldened to come out to rally. They're going to be more emboldened. Why do these activists and inspiring these activists outweigh even if some individuals think this is greenwashing? 1, these activists are the most passionate individuals for the cause. 2, they're the most progressive actors and are therefore most likely to accurately represent the desires of oppressed and vulnerable communities. 3, they're the most likely actors to actually spread the message. That is, if you hate the idea that Yale's name was changed, it's not necessarily a symbol that you latch onto unless you're already somebody who is an alt-right activist. On comparative, the symbol that you latch onto on our side is for individuals who are already liberal. There's a symbol for them to latch onto. 3, when they say the average student will be less committed to politics now, they don't know how absolutely liberal Yale students can be in general. But the weighing that you need to do here is that individuals who are committed are the activists who are actually likely to create pressure in the first place. But 4, let's assume their best case scenario, that Yale is just doing this because of greenwashing, right? LO drops the argument from Viggy's speech as to why even an act, it is nominal, is likely to create internal political pressure and public pressure for future acts. That is, at the point at which you commit yourself into a stance of saying we're changing our name to Harriet Tubman College because we are standing against racism, it means that university administrators can say literally fuck all at the point at which you are told that you are actively discriminating against Black students, at the point at which you are told that you are contributing to the over-policing of the New Haven community. We think it is much harder for them to defend their actions, for them to defend their mitigatory, like milquetoast reforms, at the point where they take a political stance that does position them as saying they are more liberal in this particular instance. So even if it is greenwashing, we think it leads to future stances that reify their commitment to the progressive in the public sphere. Next, opening opposition says we keep the name because it admits our harms, right? 1, this isn't an act of admittance at the point at which the name itself is something that's glorified in the status quo, i.e. when Yale students sing the Elahu Yale name, when they sing the fight song during the Harvard-Yale game every freaking year. 2, opening up loses their own case when they concede that you can still remember things and admit your past wrongs by putting the name Elihu Yale in a museum, right? The same way that they would defend doing with conservative statues of slave owners. At that point, it's not clear that the name Elihu Yale goes away into the ether forever. Viggy concedes it will still become a part of discussion. The part of discussion that it becomes about, though, is about how he was a terrible human being who did terrible things in the first place. Then they say we get more scholarships for Black students with no particular link as to how this is the case, which doesn't engage with the status quo where Yale doesn't currently do much for the Black community, but needs some sort of impetus of political pressure to lock it into doing more for the Black community in the first place. Then they say Black students will have backlash and microaggressions. I'm going to respond to this with the principal framing. That is, we ought to respect the revealed preferences of those who are the most vulnerable to have principal obligations that are owed to them fulfilled. That is when Black students are throwing, or Black individuals are throwing chairs through walls because they don't like the name Calhoun College, when Black activists are shouting for conservative statues to be taken down, the revealed preference and restitution that they are reparatively owed is more important than some marginal harm that they themselves know that they might incur in the future in the first place. Xiao, hit me. Yo, Xiao.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so firstly, I would love for you to tell me how anyone ever critiques Yale for being racist when they're called literally the Harriet Tubman University. Secondly, please tell me why this will be seen as a substantive movement for the renaming movement, as opposed to something that is pale and transient.
Yeah, sure. 1, the reason they are more likely to criticize it when it's called Harriet Tubman is because it's more hypocritical for a school called Harriet Tubman University to do racist things. Recognize that the margins of change that you get in this debate are not going to come from moderates who sit on their ass being apathetic about anything. The margins of change come from activists who call out hypocritical institutions. Recognize that there's a value in a society today where Virginia mayors can use the Aunt Jemima trope to uniquely recognizing Black women in society. The recognition that Black women who have been overlooked far too long, not only within their own communities, but in society as a whole, is important because we create a unique platform to not only just discuss why Elihu Yale was a shitty human being, but to discuss why Harriet Tubman herself was a valuable individual. The question that people will ask is, why did they pick Harriet Tubman? It opens the door and creates the platform to discuss the unique issues that Black women face in our society today, the unique issues they faced in the 60s with forced sterilization and continue to face. We are happy to have that be the locus for discourse. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
I want to talk about 3 things. First, I'm going to clash with the principle. Secondly, I'm going to talk about student life. And finally, I'm going to talk about social changes. First of all, on the principle, this principle is ridiculous. The name and the institution is relatively far removed from the individual, and the way in which they have so far built this principle argument was with an intuition pump and assuming that just because this individual is complicit, that is enough to change the name entirely. Look, during that time, all all white individuals were complicit. All white individuals benefited and experienced this privilege. The logical extension of this principle is that you can remove all white individuals' names from these institutions, which is absolutely ridiculous. Secondly, though, for a team that constantly stresses the principle, they did not engage with ours, which is, this is wrong because these institutions such as Yale that get the public PR of this profit off of this. This is the same thing as corporations greenwashing. This is the same thing as corporations making Black Lives Matter shirts and then afterward getting the money off of this. The good PR that you get from this small symbolic gesture that took literally no real sacrifice from Yale means that they are profiting off of the backs of these oppressed individuals. Finally, though, at best, most of the principle washes down towards the harms of re-traumatizing students. So if I prove that on your side, you re-traumatize these students more, we clearly win this clash. On to student life and students. The first thing Naomi tells you that was not engaged with at all is that this tokenizes individuals and forces the minority students to defend this. I want to be very clear. Every time there's a discussion of the coronavirus, I get asked about what my thoughts are on the Chinese government. The way in which individuals make decisions and see and have this discussion forces individuals to be re-traumatized way, way more. It looks like things such as individual, like every time there's a discussion about terrorism, looking at the one brown student inside of the class. And many of these students probably don't even necessarily support the Yale being completely changed in their names. So what does this look like? Number one, it looks like forcing individuals to justify their own traumatic experiences to convince white individuals that this was the correct move. Number two, it looks like retaliatory attacks being predominantly aimed at brown students, even though they might not necessarily have been part of this decision. And finally, it looks like everyone who might have a complicated identity, individuals named Eli, such as CEO mentioned, individuals that potentially ended up becoming and converting into Christianity due to awful colonial practices in the past. Oftentimes, these are nuanced parts of their identity, and this re-traumatizes these individuals when they have to justify their identity. The harm on students of re-traumatization was an assertive mechanism that comes from opening government. It was not substantiated and gave you illustrations why it's worse off on their side. The second thing we told you, though, is that this oftentimes leads to massive pinkwashing, i.e., the ability to push for discussions of atrocities is significantly lower. Who is going to be the liberal person that ends up saying that the Harriet Tubman school is racist? Who has the incentive in the media to do that? Sure, they might seem more hypocritical, but the problem is one of redundancy, where you paint this narrative of liberals never wanting, liberals always wanting too much. In that instance, no one is going to care because it sounds crazy for you to be that one individual to try to spark that discussion of racism within the Harriet Tubman College. The second part of this, though, is the opportunity cost of this. Social movements have a limited amount of time. They have a limited amount of media. When it predominantly becomes about renaming Yale, the interviews become discussions about renaming Yale rather than the active discriminatory practices that Yale participates in. Finally, though, I would actually argue for some students, especially for minority students, the ability to go to an institution and say, honestly, fuck you towards a racist institution is very powerful. For example, me going towards and doing successfully at a Canadian institution that has been largely based and built off of the back of oppression on Chinese individuals within Canada, has shown to some extent my ability to feel empowered by saying that, look, no matter how hard you have tried, you're not able to stop my ability to have progress and my ability to advance. Of course, this is not a blanket statement on everyone. However, for some individuals, the alternative in which you do force everyone to defend this and re-traumatize them is significantly worse. Finally, on political and social consequences, I'm going to add a bit of a new constructive material here. I think that the Trump administration is likely to be very threatened by this, and in order to signal to other educational institutions not to do this, they're likely to crack down on Yale. What does that look like? That means taking away federal scholarships from Yale students. That looks like things such as being able to boycott Yale. That means that oftentimes the harms to minority students or removing funding, which means upping off things such as the total amount of admission within Yale, which meaningfully harms minority students significantly more. The second thing that we wanted, though, is that this bolsters free speech legislation. This bolsters alt-right groups. The reason why we know this is because the entire Gov case is hung off of the potency of this narrative. it is so potent that it will push for liberal activism. It is so potent that it's going to push for free speech activism, which makes these places actively less safe spaces for individuals, in which the re-traumatizing that we discussed actually becomes worse. Go ahead, closing government.
All right. Precisely per your analysis that Yale profits from this in terms of PR, isn't this an extremely compelling incentive for every other university, Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, to follow in its footsteps and create a tangible movement with meaningful social change rather than one school merely doing this?
Right, two things here. Number one, there is no analysis as to why Harvard and other institutions are likely to do this. But secondly, and much more importantly, when Trump cracks down on this institution, and they have an incentive to deter other institutions, or when it is that you get massive right-wing populism and free speech legislation put inside the states, it massively, massively harms these minority students significantly more. Perhaps you get the benefit of Harvard renaming themselves. Our analysis is that this actively gets rid of atrocities and re-traumatizes these students to a far, far greater extent. It is a significantly larger impact. The final thing we told you about was that it was far less likely for activism to happen. The way in which Gov mentioned this is that, oh yes, they're going to just interrogate these institutions a little bit more. But the problem with this is that there's no more of that incentive for introspection. We gave you Mex about the opportunity cost. We gave you Mex about how it is that certain liberal groups are less comfortable criticizing something called the Harriet Tubman Institution out of fear that they themselves will also likely to look racist as well. Panel. Much of the principle in this debate ultimately falls onto the students. We have proven that the students are re-traumatized. We have proven that free speech activism becomes stronger and that it makes this institutions less safe spaces. We told you that it makes individuals complacent. And finally, we told you that it hurts the institution as a whole. Minority students are far better off on our side of the house. Proud to stand on OO.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the government.
Testing, can everybody hear me? Testing, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, Pasha, you're audible.
Thank you so much. Opening government correctly identified the existence of a moral retributive obligation that lies on Yale as a debt. However, they misidentify the creditor of this redistributive burden, that is, the individuals to whom that debt is owed. It is not, per opening half, the students in the community of Yale or Harvard or Brown or any other elite institutions, even if they are minorities. These individuals are actually the beneficiaries of Yale's expropriation of labor and wealth. They're the beneficiaries of centuries of white supremacy and oppression on the Black body, on poor individuals, and on the rest of the world. All of the analysis of the harms to Yale students or students like us is myopic in comparison to the structural and massive advantages they get over people in Africa, over people in the developing world whose labor was expropriated and who don't get the same opportunities as these individuals. The true creditors, therefore, are the students not at Yale, who have disproportionate ethnic or socioeconomic minorities, at state schools, at community colleges in the US, at lower level universities in the West, and at international schools. Note that opening has ignored this group completely and therefore is irrelevant in the round. I don't care about reform at Yale, regardless if it's good or bad. Even if 100% of students at Yale are Black minorities from the US, this does not fulfill the redistributive burden towards Black individuals in Africa and the opportunities they're deprived of. Note, therefore, this outweighs all of the weighing in the top half on a principled level, as I just explained, and also on a pragmatic level, that is, these are the least well-off individuals and the people where there's the most of those individuals in general. OO says, the only contestation to the philosophical framework coming out of the last speech is, oh, well, aren't all white people responsible? We say, yes, we must redistribute the ill-begotten wealth of elite Western educational institutions. And in this round, we're going to start with the most valuable asset that they have, the brand equity that is latent in their name. So first extension, how does the renaming help the true creditors? And how does it, why is the brand name important to Yale and how does it destroy it? The name is important because it's a remarkable branding asset. In fact, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are maybe some of the most valuable branding assets in the world, better than Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble or Johnson & Johnson. It is an incredible asset at recruiting individuals in the US and abroad as students, and it is an incredible asset at making the degree incredibly valuable and creating, because employers value that and other society values it, etc. We found out, especially in round 2 of this tournament, that the name is a vital heuristic used by employers and friends and societies, etc. So the alternative when we get rid of these historically value-laden names like Yale and potentially Harvard and Stanford, I'm going to talk about them in a second, is that we default to more actually meritocratic aspects. For instance, standardized tests, proficiency tests, and coding exams for the actual job you're getting, grades, and your experience in the industry. This means 2 things. A, it means for the population that we are concerned with, it redistributes opportunities that were previously locked away within these institutions of power to those people, so therefore they can access those opportunities on a much more level playing field. Obviously, this is a marginal impact. There's still going to be disparities, but we get rid of the asset that is the brand name, such that Yale students now need to compete not on the name, which is entirely ill-begotten, but on their actual efforts and on the learning that they've had. Note the second big impact, this empowers the financial elite legacy class that exists in Oxbridge and Princeton, Harvard, and Yale, because they no longer have this disproportionate foot on the table market advantage that perpetuates a oligarchic class within Western institutions that has a hegemonic hold on power. We loosen that hegemonic hold on power within those institutions and within the world by opening it up to a much more diverse array and a much more diverse coalition of individuals. This is where OO's material, I think, we agree with. OO says Trump is going to crack down on Yale and get rid of their financial aid. Fucking great. Take it away. Rutgers will take it. We'll use it. It's better for Rutgers to have it. Second, and even if it is redistributed, it's better for fewer U.S. institutions to have financial aid because then institutions internationally can compete with them better. Second, they say, oh, well, there's going to be more free speech legislation and they're going to destroy all these institutions of learning. Fucking great again. Destroy the hegemonic institutions of learning that exist in the West. Open up the international markets to regular people who actually deserve it. Second, how does this change cause a trend and a movement in changing names worldwide and across? First, there's going to be massive competition among elite institutions in the status quo to follow Yale in this. Why? A, because the consumers that they're catering to are predominantly young consumers in the United States who are very, very liberal. Once Yale does this, and I'm going to explain the psychological tipping effects about this in a second, in order to attract these individuals to charge the high prices that they charge, they're going to have to compete against Yale, who is now going to be attracting massive amounts of these young people, and their parents are going to be paying for them, and as a result, they're going to have to change their names. Second of all, faculty and teachers are predominantly liberal as well. In fact, incredibly liberal. They're also going to put massive pressure on administrators to change these things. This is why we've seen incremental reforms, such as at Princeton with Woodrow Wilson, et cetera. Note that the reason they didn't want to rename Woodrow Wilson School is because of the massive amount of brand equity that Woodrow Wilson has. So, and they had to get rid of that as a result. The B subpoint here is that the tipping point analysis. Yale is a massive thought leader, and without this kind of tipping point, it won't happen. Woodrow Wilson is a good start, but once Yale gets rid of their brand name that is latent in Yale, it becomes incumbent upon all these other competitors to compete with them. We believe that there needs to be a push for this rallying effect to occur. For instance, just like when one person self-immolating in Tibet can cause a massive revolt, or for instance, when one Confederate statue being taken down can lead to an entire movement of Confederate statues being taken down across the board. I'm going to take a POI from opening.
Yeah, so can you, given that there is no clear mechanisms on how you genuinely affect minority students or minorities in general, can you engage with our analysis about how this re-traumatizes students and actively makes it a less safe space when free speech clubs become more
No, I actually won't engage because I just don't care. Because my argument, if you listened, was that I can get rid of Yale, and that means students at Rutgers or at Mercer County Community College get a better chance at their jobs. I just don't care about free speech protections at Yale. I'm really sorry. Or at your school. I just don't know what school you go to. So what then are we left with at the end of the round, which is I'm going to give you 2 types of weighing mechanisms. One is a marginal weighing mechanism. That is to say that if we lose a few schools, Yale and Harvard, maybe Princeton is safe for a while because they're named after a town and they're not named after some other schools, but we think that they're going to follow also for all the same reasons. They're going to have to compete. They're going to rename, maybe not Princeton, but they're going to get rid of their brand equity in other ways. The marginal benefit here of every bit of that brand equity being chipped away means a much more level playing field for other institutions of learning, both in the United States and abroad. Secondly, note the probabilistic weighing here, which is if we have some small % chance of efficacy in having this kind of structural change, that means worldwide change in the distribution of wealth. That means potentially the solution to the massive social economic crises that are happening in the West, where there's a massive accumulation of wealth at the very top echelons of society, and most individuals, and there's broad wealth and income gaps. This is the thing that we seek to solve, and we're going to start with Yale. We're very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
Not muted. Can everyone hear me? I'll just assume that's a yes. Cool. 1 second. The failure in this debate has been to go for these massive, crazy impacts, which I think is ludicrous. Like, think for a second on closing government's extension, because their extension was actually, if Yale changes its name to Harriet Tubman College, then all the bankers at Goldman Sachs that graduated from Yale are not smart enough to realize the Yale guy just has a different name for his college. This is crazy. Like, their lines about brand equity are literally crazy because all the advantages of Yale still exist. And Will, I don't think you're muted, but if you could mute, that would be lovely. I think the problem in this debate is been one where opening government bites off a massive burden. Opening opposition has this crazy line where they think minority students are just going to be hounded by the Yale Daily News instead of, I don't know, maybe the Yale Daily News talking to like the people that had the idea for the movement instead. Like, also crazy. And closing opposition goes with a batshit insane extension about how this is going to help redistribute wealth to Africa. Like, guys, let's be reasonable, let's be simple, and let's focus on what actually matters. The claim from closing the opposition is going to be extraordinarily simple. We are going to tell you why this discredits the movement about renaming things more broadly, why there's a principle. But first, I want to talk about the morals, like how we associate names. I think the reason that the POI Billy asked in OG was so important was because it pointed out that a name is not harmful just because one bad person did one bad thing as a result of that name. Like, the reason we think that it was good to rename things like Calhoun, or good to rename the Woodrow Wilson College, or good to take down Confederate statues is because the association of those things is irreparably tied to bad things. But this isn't true with Yale. And I want to be clear here, because no one has actually asked themselves in this entire debate, who came up with the idea to cancel Yale? Guys, it wasn't the liberals. It was Jesse Kelly and Ann Coulter that on Twitter thought it'd be really funny to tweet, #cancel Yale. Anish, if you don't believe me, look it up yourself. But in all of these things, it is conservative movements that you are playing into. All of these things mean that it is not actually tangibly associated. And I want to be clear as to why. Because it is not true that most people associate Yale with Elihu Yale. The vast majority of people have no clue who Elihu Yale is, compared to like the vast majority of people knowing that if a Confederate statue is there, it's irreparably tied to slavery. The things that people associate Yale with are the things like the sports or the community or the good research or the Nobel Prize laureate faculty that they have. And I think this is meaningful because Chris, in his reductio ad all white people in opening opposition, misses the impact of this. Because the impact of this is, one, that we think there is an affirmative right to associate. And I want to be clear here. What Yale is a community. That is what most people associate with. And it is a form of identity. Like, you work hard to be associated with its legacy. There are 400 years of good progress and success that you have. And I think we generally give the right to everyone to associate with like whatever groups they're a part of, as long as it doesn't construct meaningful harm to people. The burden on opening government was to prove that the name meant something to people that it just didn't. And the reason is, and I think you can see this pretty clearly, while people have pushed to rename Calhoun College, while student activists have pushed to rename the Woodrow Wilson School, no one cares about renaming Yale. This is a principled violation. Because when you strip this identity and you strip this right, like, yes, you rename the college, yes, there is still a brand equity, but erasing the word Yale from the lexicon takes away a meaningful part of your identity. And just because this applies to a conventionally privileged set of people doesn't matter, because it encompasses all of opening government stakeholders and all of opening oppositions as well. And the principled violation is far stronger than opening opposition's best claim. The Yale Daily News just harasses people randomly. More importantly, I think all the monetary advantages still stay, but the identity is something that changes differently. You get the advantages at Goldman Sachs, but there is a meaningful distinction in the community that you had before. The second thing to say here is just that this discredits real parts of the renaming movement. Opening opposition also claims way too much. Like, their crazy idea is all of a sudden, if you hear this, you're just going to be like, I want to join Turning Point USA. Trump is right. Trump 2020, woo. Ludicrous. Like, it is probably not true that Trump is going to take funding away from this, probably because there are more important things that he cares about. But also, if you thought that was true, he would have done it already, because already Yale and Princeton are renaming colleges. Like, the meaningful bright line at which opening opposition happens isn't true. But what is more likely? What is more likely is that it discredits the real part of renaming movements. So people who, like, like being a part of the Harvard institution and like having the Harvard brand name, don't want to rename Harvard. And consequently, they think that any elements on the road to renaming things and on the road to renaming like the bad halls or the university chairs that are endowed by some like racist 30 years ago, they don't rename those. And I want to be clear about why this is so important, because there is a meaningful distinction between the legitimate claims of grievances, i.e. the Woodrow Wilson International Affairs School, and the claims of grievances that are random. Yale is not tied to meaningfully to slavery, where Yale as an institution stands for something else and where people associate it with something else. I want to be clear about why this wins the debate. The point of opening government, and I think that the strongest central claim from government bench in the debate, is that this is a substantive win for the renaming movement, something that closing government echoes. But this is a problem, because what they had to prove was two things. One, they had to prove that the renaming movement wants this. They don't. And it's pretty obvious why they don't. Because while people may tangibly associate Calhoun with racism, they do not associate Yale with racism in the same way that they do with all these other names. But the second thing is that the vast majority of people don't see this as a substantive. They see it as performative, and that discredits the movement. i.e., at best, all you are doing is feeding into a set of right-wing trolls that wanted to prove how ridiculous it is that people are renaming statues and people are renaming colleges. That is their best case. They feed into the existing right-wing troll sentiment. I think the thesis of CO is pretty simple. We don't want to do what the trolls want. Open it.
Black activists like Khalil Green know who Eli Yale is, they know what he stood for and what he stands for now. They are owed a reparative obligation and do the cost-benefit analysis themselves. This idea originated in a report submitted by a Yale student government to the university.
Ingenuous it is to say that, you know, the black student body president of Yale is owed something. Like, I don't think you get to talk about that. I don't think you get to talk about what that specific person is owed. But more importantly, yes, like Anish is right. It's like a 91-page report that Yale had. If you actually read the report, you'd notice that that was the committee's report on why they shouldn't rename Calhoun College, because then people would push for them to rename Yale instead. Like, what kind of moral discrepancies or like moral like random bankruptcy do you have to think that all of a sudden, just because we can make one performative claim and we say, this totally helps like one guy, even though that's not actually true, how disingenuous do you have to be to think that this is the only thing that matters? Guys, there are legitimate claims as to why we should rename certain institutions. There are legitimate claims when they are tied irreparably to things like slavery, tied irreparably to bad things. But a name is more than the name. The name of Yale has come to mean something else. And consequently, renaming it takes away that kind of value, and more importantly, takes away the value that it has for being Harvard's second college. Very, very proud to oppose, and I'm out of time.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the government.
All right, everyone can hear me? All right, good to go. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Right. 2 bits of extraneous rebuttal and 2 questions of weighing and framing. So the first bit of rebuttal, to their extension, is this principled notion of a right to associate, right? And I think that, like, ultimately, even if you completely buy that this is true, as we told you, we simply do not care, right? We don't care about the hedge fund managers, the elites going to Yale, and this right, when there is a much, much more deep and principled violation that is occurring, right? So just do the weighing here, right? The actual violation that is occurring is not just the harm to Black students, but the reparative obligation that exists that is not being distributed, that Pasha talked about in terms of Yale developing this brand name worth billions of dollars, having profited from it, and like continuing on this legacy, right? Secondly, this extension is particularly laughable, we think, is just this idea that this discredits the movements. Guys, you're feeding the trolls, right? One, this just seems exceptionally not unique, right? They'll just find the next thing to troll about, and it doesn't seem like a reason not to do this. But as we gave you in our analysis, we are massively expanding the renaming movement tremendously, right? We are saying that not only is it the case that the super obviously bad people, like conservative, Confederate generals and their statues should be taken down, that everyone within society needs to interrogate these problems of people like Yale that merely existed during a time where slavery was okay and profited from slavery, that is also insufficient, right? So let me get to the two actual major questions within this round. First, what are the obligations that actually exist for Yale in this round? OG correctly identifies the obligation that they need to stop causing harm by continuing this legacy of this racist name. But we in CG uniquely introduced a much more compelling, we think, the most primary obligation that exists for Yale, that being a restitutive obligation, right? That it's not good enough to continue existing and profiting off of this name that existed from plunder and from violence, right? We told you that the most exceptionally valuable asset that Yale has, literally worth tens of billions of dollars, is its title, is its name, and the prestige associated with that. And on our side of the house, we argue that there is necessarily an obligation to redistribute the value that is embedded within that name, that was unjustly acquired through plunder and subjugation of the Black body, towards the people that were actually harmed, right? Not like the students at Yale, not any of these people or the hedge fund managers, but the actual people, for instance, in South Asia, who are the descendants of the people that he enslaved. So what we tell you is that when Yale does this, and as we demonstrate later, when Yale doing this creates a movement where almost all elite colleges are forced into renaming themselves, the equity of the prestige that is embedded within their names is then redistributed among all the remaining institutions, right? The community colleges, the schools in India and China that can't possibly compete with the notion of Yale, right? They say, but guys, it's like, Yale is still Yale, right? People will still recognize this. But I think this misses the more longer term analysis, right? Perhaps through time, the first few years, the first generation, that this still exists as a name. But we think that in the future, and this is incredibly important as well, because of the millions of middle-class Indian and Chinese parents that see just, stars in their eyes when you mention names like Yale and Harvard. This oppressive institution is eventually dismantled, and we empower institutions within these countries and community colleges within the United States, right? I simply don't think their analysis is long-term enough in actually internalizing this. The worst case scenario, right? Yale and Harvard still carry this prestige, but now people in these countries who have previously never heard of names like Harriet Tubman get to educate themselves and get to learn about the process through which these names were changed and transformed and the reasons for doing so. But before I move on, POI from opening, if you have one.
We told you that the name and Yale is different, my literal first piece of rebuttal. We told you this is performative, and we told you that right-wing trolls are going to be more powerful. So please engage with this, or what closing opposition called their extension.
Okay. Getting right to it then, right? We told you that even if this is performative, this isn't going to be merely restricted to Yale, and when this becomes a broader movement, this will actually create positive change that the trolling can't refute, right? Pasha gave you specific warrants for this that were completely unrefuted, right? We told you that within the domain of prestigious education, there is an extremely competitive market, right? Schools like Yale are trying to attract the incredibly competent students that have the choice between going to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, right? And by doing this, they need ways to be able to differentiate themselves. This is why things like need-blind admissions, this is why things like being test optional in COVID always started from these schools and then trickled down to all other educational institutions, right? If we think of college prestige as an oligopolistic market, then leaders like Yale that have the most market share have the price-setting power, right? And thus, when Yale does this, we say that other colleges are essentially compelled to doing so, as per O's own analysis, right? That Yale profits from this in terms of PR, and this is a token, greenwashing move. We say when Yale does this and takes this action and is the first one to do so, and all other schools do it, then this becomes a tipping point, right? This is the reason why someone self-immolating in Tunisia can start an entire movement that topples the government. When Yale takes this action that is so obvious that everyone can recognize it as a call to action, not merely just renaming a random dorm hall, but getting rid of their name worth tens of billions of dollars, we think that this creates the movement. So then the question is, what movement do we actually create, right? I think this is clearly where we come out ahead of OG, because we just force multiply all of OG's impacts 100-fold, right? And we specifically provided to you the mechanistic warrants besides just empowering activists for why schools like Harvard and Stanford and Princeton will need to change their names as well. We also think that the movement that you engender is a difference in kind and not merely a difference in degree from merely this continual push to rename things, right? We think that by targeting Yale specifically, you send a profoundly powerful moral message, right? Yes, we agree, all slave owners during that time are complicit, right? It is simply not good enough to be as racist as everyone else was during that time. And we think that is the biggest problem with contemporary politics, right? Is an exceptionally lack of impetus to act, to say something like, I nominally support Black Lives Matter, but I can't be asked to donate or to protest. We are saying that is not good enough, that anyone who is complicit during that time of history or right now are complicit and need to change, that you need to be exceptional and supererogatory like Harriet Tubman in order to make a difference in this world. We propose.
Hello?
Thank you
Am I
very much
audible?
for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker.
Hi, sorry. Am I clear? Hello? Am I audible?
Will, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Give me one moment to organize my papers. All right. Starting in 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What closing opposition does in this debate is it contextualizes this particular action not as significant in the broader liberal conservative division, because frankly, liberals and conservatives, like the vast majority of America, do not give a shit about this particular discursive change in elite academic institutions, but significant in this particular brand of activism, significant in this particular renaming movement, and we explain why it massively harms the efficacy of that movement and real legitimate claims that individuals have. And even if this claim is to some extent real and legitimate, we posit that it is still far less real and legitimate than the other sorts of claims that individuals have, like the fact that you should have roads taken down from these various institutions, like the fact that Georgetown should pay reparations to those that have benefited from these particular things. The theme of this debate, as alluded to by Aditya, is all teams reaching for huge improbable impacts without actually ever proving any of these particular claims. What you are weighing, panel, at the end of this is incredibly marginal discursive shifts coming out from opening half and a completely ludicrous batshit extension coming out from closing government versus the guarantee that this discredits the movement in a way that is meaningful. Prime Minister is correct. Eli is a 3-letter word. Yale is a 4-letter word. And no one associates Yale in this particular instance with this particular individual. Opening opposition says this is what they said, because the DLO asserted at the top of its speech that Yale is not associated with this person. Number one, we're distinct because we actually give analytic reasons as to why this is the case. That is A, because individuals, like individuals within Yale, associate the name with Yale with the memories and the sports teams and the friends that they cultivated there, the community identity that is built there that is not at all tied down to this particular individual. And secondly, because this is precisely the kind of, and secondly, because other individuals external of Yale don't associate Yale with this Eli Yale anyway, because they associate it with the academic institutions. And secondly, we actually demonstrate why this characterization is important, because it's not just that it undercuts OG's harms, but that it discredits real problems that currently exist. What did we hear by way of response from that previous speaker? The only response we heard that is distinct from their extension is that this is non-unique because right-wing trolls will find things to troll anyway. Two responses. Firstly, if this particular action is as important as OG says it is, then it is the case that it is incredibly likely that this is a significant point at which people view the renaming movement as illegitimate. The second thing is this doesn't address the mechanisms Aditya gives you. That is that this particular argument, given that most people do not believe that Yale as the name is associated at all with Eli Yale, demonstrates to moderates that this particular principle and the movement of that extends from this principle is absolutely absurd. That is, it seems like any tenuous connection that that someone could draw to someone who at some point was complicit with the slave trade movement is something that should be renamed and something that should be excluded. And even if in principle these people are actually complicit and OG is right in this case, the problem is that in practice, the vast majority of individuals do not believe in this principled connection between these two individuals or between these particular names, and at which point you do discredit the movement massively in this particular instance. Why is it sufficient to weigh out the round in a number of cases? Number one, because these are the actual issues that people are legitimately traumatized by, that people that are massive, and those causes are massively harmed by government's model. That is based on open government's own metric of galvanizing the movement and preventing psychological trauma. We should be focusing our efforts on, roads must fall and giving Georgetown individuals reparations, as opposed to renaming Yale, which literally no one cares about in this particular instance. The renaming movement should focus on actual names that are problematic. The second thing is it outweighs the other two arguments based on plausibility, because unlike what opening opposition says, this is not going to make Trump super powerful or make Trump crack down on free speech, because that seems rather ridiculous. And unlike what closing government says, as I'll get onto right now, this is not going to change the redistribution of wealth in the world. I'm going to talk about two further things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about closing government and the problem with American parliamentary debating. The second thing I'm going to talk about is opening government and their absurd characterization. Firstly, on closing government and the problem with American parliamentary debating, that is, they never proved insufficiency. For this extension to hold any water, they need to prove that once IVs no longer become IVs, the point at which you change their name. And their only assertion for this is that the brand name is something that is important to people. Four sorts of barriers that still exist. Number one, people will still hire from Harriet Tubman University precisely because they still know it is that same academic institution that is very good at training people, that is like their father's institution and things like that. Secondly, because these institutions have alumni networks that necessarily get them in and jobs. Thirdly, because these are probably more wealthy individuals anyway. And fourthly, because there's specific technological resources in these particular places. Their weighing here is absurd. They say any small change in the unevening scale is more important because these are more important stakeholders. Number one, some marginal evening out of the playing field does not address these massive structural inequalities that currently exist, even if the name changes. And secondly, they can't just weigh some incredibly small probability of that particular issue changing, because I have no idea how that manifests in a particular impact in this debate. Secondly, on opening half, there are two gridlocks in this half that are not resolved. The first is it easier to critique an institution based on explication or hypocrisy, no weighing as to which one's more important? And secondly, does explication of the problem or success of the movement more effectively galvanize people? Galvanize like the liberals? Again, no explication of which one was more important. That is the reason why opening half is at this moment unresolved. Before I move on to opening government, I'll take opening government.
Black people and activists know who Harriet Tubman is and prefer she become the worldwide symbol of intellectual prestige. We inspire activists to fight for drastic change, empowering the renaming movement because we—
Yeah, so I'm getting onto that now. Okay. So the entire premise of the OG case and the contingency is that this will be perceived as a substantive win for the particular renaming movement. The reason why this is the contingency is, number one, because if it's the case that people do not perceive Yale to be, Y-A-L-E to be associated with Eli Yale, then they're unlikely to be traumatized principally from hearing the name Yale. This is also true for the vast majority of African American individuals that we're talking about. Secondly, if it's the case that people do not perceive this as a substantive win for the renaming movement, then it will not galvanize people in a way that is meaningful. And we give substantive reasons to prove that this trend is not the case, given that the vast majority of people do not associate Yale with this particular individual. On the principle though, number one, they have already conceded this, the point at which they demonstrate that Eli is a 3-letter word and Yale is also a 4-letter word in this particular instance. The second thing to say, it's that traumatization is not actually traumatization if it's the case that no one associates it with that past trauma. On the issue of galvanizing activists and opening opposition on this particular issue, no one demonstrates that this is a significant tipping point to galvanizing activists, insofar as there have been other sorts of renaming institutions around the world, things like Roads Must Fall, things like Woodrow Wilson. There's no reason as to why this is the particular point at which now the movement takes off, at which, but unless under our side of the house the movement doesn't take off, which means that there's no comparative difference here. The second thing to note is that in terms of people engaging with the renaming movement in the first place, that is already being done in the status quo, but it will be discredited under their side of the house when you do this thing that no one else agrees with or that no one else associates with. This was not a debate about redistributing wealth or about changing the liberal conservative spectrum. This was a debate about the renaming movement and the harmful discrediting effects that this policy would have. Yale is a 4-letter word. It is nothing more. That is why we oppose.
So I'd like to thank all the speakers for the debate, and we will now adjudicate. What I'm going to do is, I'm not going to give a full call because we didn't come up with a full call of the debate. I'll give you the team which won. We'll explain how we came to that decision. Please feel free to talk to any one of the panel later for further feedback. So after a relatively long discussion, the panel came to a consensus that the winning team is the team in closing opposition. To briefly explain why that ended up being the call, I think it's worth noting that all judges had different teams in second and different teams in contention, such that it isn't straightforward to work out who was second or third or fourth. But just to explain why teams lost to closing opposition, I'm going to start with closing government, because I think in some ways this was the more clear, the clear team which had lost to closing opposition. Broadly, while we liked the very interesting and bold frame by closing opposition, closing government, which was that we have reparative obligations to people who are outside the United States and definitive people who are outside Ivy League colleges. We could even believe that this was a tipping point for very structural reasons, which led to multiple universities changing their names. The question which closing government are asked by closing opposition is, do people, as a result of Yale changing its name, not still think of it as Yale? Or do you not still think of an Ivy as an Ivy, even if the name has changed? And I don't think there is enough of a response to that from closing government. There are some responses in the whip which are broadly that this may be true over time, over a generation. This may have a larger impact in places like India or in China. And even though we thought these were good starts of responses, I think it wasn't very clear to any of us on the panel that those were sufficient responses, in part, presumably over generations. Harriet Tubman University would probably end up having a similar reputation rather than a mass redistribution across the world. So while it was a very bold extension and one which I think we all enjoyed, in the end, the mechanistic question as to whether you actually get the outcomes claimed had been questioned significantly by closing opposition, and as a result, closing opposition end up beating closing government. To turn then to opening government and comparing opening government to closing opposition, which is where we spent a lot of time in this debate. There are two core claims made by opening government. The first one of these is a principal one, which goes in two different ways. One is that there is trauma for individuals who are parts of minorities, whether they be Black or whether they be South Asian, from Yale and the association with the name Yale. There are lots of responses to that from opening up, which we'll talk about in a moment, but when we compare that specifically to closing opposition, what I think closing opposition say about this is severalfold. One, the association of Yale is a very weak one, in part because, in part these were factual claims that people don't even really associate Eli Yale with Yale, but other ones would seem to be relatively intuitive, that it is quite different than Woodrow Wilson or Cecil Rhodes, which I think everyone associates with some images of white supremacy. And at the very least, Eli Yale doesn't quite meet those standards. Secondly, even to the degree there is this principle, I think from both opening government and I think opening opposition, and to some degree closing opposition as well, it didn't actually end up becoming the dominant issue in this debate. That maybe there is some trauma to some individuals. There was probably quite a few responses. There was probably enough reason to suggest that these weren't going to be a large number of people. And to the degree there is trauma being caused, I think there is a distinction which is made by closing opposition between Yale and other institutions. That partially depends on a fact, but I don't think it depends entirely on a fact. Then the more important claim from opening government is whether or not you are able to strengthen activism. And I think every team in the debate argues that strengthening activism, at least in some areas, is good. There are two subsets of this claim from opening government. The first one of these, or the second one of these, is that you strengthen the movement in other parts of the United States and other parts of the world. The reasoning for this is that you have an image of success. The response we get very directly to that by closing opposition is, why do you need Yale, or changing the name Yale, as the image of success? Why can't the Rhodes statues or the Woodrow Wilson School be enough? What we didn't then hear from opening government, and part of it's obviously you don't speak after closing opposition, I don't even think implicit in opening government speech is why the Yale name change has the huge impact they wanted to. Because I feel that most of what you claim about Yale also seems to be true about these other symbols. So what is it about Yale per se that makes the difference? The second response to this from closing opposition is, given there isn't that much demand to change Yale, this doesn't even seem to be a hugely substantive shift. I think it is probably fair to give them the credit to say there isn't the same kind of demand to change the name Yale, even though I guess it does become a factual question to what degree there is some demand to change it. But nonetheless, I don't think there are implicit responses to opening government to these claims, and at which point we thought closing opposition had taken them away from you. The other claim which you then make is that this is beneficial for Yale itself and changing the way Yale operates. Again, I think closing opposition's responses to this effectively become the same, which is people don't care that much. I think the difficulty in talking about this point vis-a-vis closing opposition is I think opening opposition create many more problems for you on this argument than closing opposition does. But I think what we want to flag here is, even though we thought this argument was relatively well made in the first speech and in the second speech, I don't think it is good enough at responding clearly and convincingly enough to the alternative mechanisms as why you don't get pushback by opening opposition. So even to the degree closing opposition don't take that argument away from you, it wasn't clear you were winning this argument significantly enough for it to outweigh the other claims which were being made by closing opposition. I would add to this, closing opposition do a little bit more in terms of some of the other harms, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the off bench. So that was broadly the reasons then why closing opposition beat opening opposition. Then in comparing closing opposition beat opening government. Then in comparing opening opposition with closing opposition. So closing opposition cover a lot of material, which is in some ways relatively similar to what we get from closing opposition. So what do we get from opening opposition? So first we get that, look, the trauma itself is being overstated. We think this is fair. I think that's slightly different than what we get from closing opposition, which is not that trauma per se is overstated, that trauma shouldn't be considered to be the most important thing in the context of the debate, but instead the trauma in this case is overstated. But nonetheless, the framing we get from opening opposition in this is there are more important things to change at Yale than the name Yale itself. So it is a little bit different than closing opposition, but that isn't the core issue when it comes to comparing the two teams. So what do opening opposition then push? That you reduce the burden on Yale and therefore harm Yale students. The analysis to this, there's multiple different pieces of analysis to this, but the two core points are that, or three core points are, one, it is highly unlikely that Yale would be criticized by people outside of Yale, because while opening government can claim there is hypocrisy, it seems like you're demanding too much if a university which has already changed its name dramatically and then attacking it for any other infringements doesn't seem like a very likely thing to occur. Fair enough, it is unclear which one of these two mechanisms is more plausible between opening government and opening opposition. But I do think there is an alternative claim by opening opposition related to this, which at the very least makes it unclear whether people will view Harriet Tubman University as hypocritical, or instead view it as having a reasonable perspective, and any further attacks on it just seem to be unnecessary. The second claim made is that the students themselves will spend less time with introspection, and the final claim related to this is that there is a Yale is progressive anchoring bias, so people won't take it seriously. So these are the claims we're getting in terms of why the more important things like actual reforms, faculty, scholarship, more Black students is more important than trivialization. The difficulty is here, when we compare you with opening government, it's unclear who actually wins these claims. Opening government's response implicitly and semi-explicitly is, we need to care most about the activists, because the activists are those who make change. So it's not about introspection of individual students, but it's about the committed activists making those changes and pushing forward changes. If that is true, and I think the mechanism of activists being emboldened isn't challenged by opening opposition, even though we could believe you don't get as much introspection per se, it doesn't seem as true if the activists are pushing forward these changes that you don't at least have to deal with some of these issues. And while there might be an anchoring bias, that is also then challenged by the claim that you are having very committed activists, which we get a lot of in the DPM speech. So the question then becomes, even if you have lots of activists, what happens then? And again, I think this ends up being a little bit unclear about what is happening on the top half, which is there is a claim that you will strengthen the right within these campuses. Fair enough, and the anger of right-wing groups within these campuses. Are these actually a large group of individuals? It is unclear whether that is the case, or the DPM is correct that you are probably discussing a small subset of individuals. I think it is probably more intuitive that this is a small subset of individuals, even though we could potentially believe it is a larger group. I don't think we get a huge amount from opening opposition to believe it is a large group of individuals, but more importantly, that these individuals would somehow prevent the kinds of reforms which you want, even though I'm sure there's people who join those groups and some of whom become alt-right may increase microaggression on campus. It's hard to weigh that if we actually believe activists become more strong and are able to make real change. The left loses some support, I think is fine as well, but I think I would note both these both these claims about right-wing groups becoming more powerful and left-wing groups losing support is more powerful with closing opposition's analysis than what we get from opening opposition. The reasoning for that is that given closing opposition are able to note this isn't a major claim for anyone, there isn't a strong association, it can just seem to be fairly extreme as a claim. If anything, closing opposition's additives to that superpower those two claims and make change a little bit less plausible than it seems. While it is fair that the DLO does mention that no one links Yale with the name with Eli Yale, it's far removed from the individual. I don't think you do enough with that or explain why that is likely to be the case for us to find that to be very compelling, even though we definitely credit you with making that claim. And I do think you then note the logical extension is that maybe you would be removing all names, but I don't think you weaponize that enough to note why that really increases the harms in terms of the growth of the right or the weakness of the left-wing movement. It becomes a little bit hard to where we fit this in to the top half clash. The final claim which is made on this is that you will end up with consequences particularly related to the Trump administration and what they are likely to do as a result, which I think is impactful and probably needed a response from opening government. We did all think that by the end, this was probably a little bit far-fetched without more analysis as to why exactly that would be the turning point in terms of how the Trump administration works. Paradoxically, the response to that is coming from closing opposition, but hey, this is what teams do now. So at the end then, when we were looking at opening opposition, while I think lots of your claims are fairly similar to what we get from closing opposition, they are able, partly by contextualizing this with facts and intuitive claims as to why these facts are likely to be true, they are able to power many of your arguments more powerfully than you make them, which means that while often in the top half was either a draw or different judges lean one way or another as to how these things would be resolved, I think closing opposition's additions actually break some of these potential deadlocks by giving us more reasons why the right or the left would react a certain way to the policy. Indeed, would probably be powered or disempowered as a result of the policy. They provide us more of an explanation as to why this trauma is unlikely to be significant, rather than just per se, there may be other reasons why we shouldn't necessarily care that much about trauma. And I think in addition to that, they're able just to push the arguments a little bit further in terms of mechanisms as to how exactly activist groups will respond and why it won't lead to the kinds of positive activist change in slightly different ways than what we've gotten from opening opposition. So then in the end, we all thought that even though the arguments are in some ways quite similar, the added analysis from closing opposition, some of it admittedly fact-based, but not all of it, does more to prove the opposition side of the debate is correct. And therefore we agreed after a fairly long discussion that closing opposition had beaten opening opposition as well, and therefore had won the debate. I'm happy to have answered particular questions, but I imagine it's probably easier for people to contact me or any of the panel in person if they want to discuss this further.